Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Just had my morning coffee, so I'm a bit coughing as usual for some reason. I like strong coffee, I'm sure that's it. So in this essay, I'd like to talk about the affirmative action decision by the United States Supreme Court, where they've struck down or have declared as illegal the use of race and minority status as a factor in deciding, primarily this was about education, so positions in university being awarded by race rather than by meritorious exam results, and also by extension, affirmative action, promotions and hiring and so on. So you can imagine there'd be a lot of lawsuits coming from this. And I imagine there'll also be effect around the rest of the Western world. I should sort of state from the outset that affirmative action is very much a globalist thing. It's been embraced by the political left because of the Marxist equal outcomes thing, but it's very much a globalist thing. We're very much globalist funded. The media companies owned by the globalists and scripted by the globalists are all for it. So let's not say that it's just some wild-eyed leftist activists are pursuing it. It's very much a globalist thing, and they just put these leftist activists out front to pretend as if it's some sort of grassroots movement of the people. It's anything but. It's a globalist gig, and it's internationally coordinated, internationally scripted, and massively funded by globalist activist groups, including the United Nations, World Economic Forum, and so on. Now, I haven't read the whole judgment, by the way, so I don't claim to know what they've got in there syllable by syllable, but I've read the synopsis, and it seems fairly clear. Now, I just want to talk about affirmative action generally. Now, affirmative action has actually been around for a long time. I think it was like the final year or penultimate year at senior high school, I think it was, the unions, teachers' unions in Australia, were at that time strongly advocating for equal outcomes between boys and girls. Now, back then, in all the major subjects, boys came first in everything. In fact, if a girl even came in the top 10 for that year, there was an intake of breath when Billie Jean's name got mentioned. And it was such an event that it was even mentioned. And coming 10th was Billie Jean, and there was so unusual and rare was it that they. Now, if you looked at there was roughly, I suppose, about half boys and half girls, give or take, high school. But in third year high school, when a lot of kids were turning 15, then there was a lot of kids were invited to leave school and saying, well, look, you're not doing any good. You're not only are you a poor student, but your attitude in class is bad. You don't give a shit, and so on. And so they're invited to leave, and there was a higher proportion of girls would leave than boys, and they would go and do apprenticeships in things like, I don't know, hairdressing or whatnot. Now, at the time, which isn't that long ago, I mean, it's in my lifetime, for goodness sakes, it was not surprising that girls would get married when they turned 18. So say as soon as they left senior high school, they would get married, they would procreate the following year, and so on. I remember girls who were getting married at 16, and they needed at the time parental consent. Boyfriend was 17, and they would get married. Some of those were shotgun weddings because she was pregnant, but nonetheless. And some of those marriages, by the way, some kids at school who left and got married, I thought they were terribly grown up, getting married and having children, by the way. And so I looked at them with almost envy, I suppose. Look how grown up they are, and which when you're 16 is a big deal, by the way. But they're still married today, which I suppose is quite rare. Maybe it was true love back then, but But just looking at what the teachers' unions insisted on is that girls have an equal amount of first places in subjects. Now, they discounted the subjects. They only wanted girls to come first in prestigious subjects. So if it was something like sewing or cooking classes, or I think they called it home science, I think might have been what they called it back in the day. Those sorts of things that didn't count. What counted was the prestigious or the boy type subjects. So if it was carpentry or sheet metalworking classes, they wanted girls to participate in those. So that was very much, the teachers. A lot of teachers were incredibly Marxist and activist. And by the way, the primary activist in the school, who was really pushing most of this, was Jewish, interestingly, and unmarried. So my guess is, well, I found it later, but he's a Jewish homosexual pushing Marxist ideology in the high school. He did so rather discreetly, though. It wasn't as overt as you see today, and I didn't even think about him being Jewish and also homosexual until years later when somebody mentioned it to somebody, like a buddy of mine at school mentioned it, and I thought, I didn't know that, but I'd never actually thought about it. I knew the guy was a strident activist in his way, but I had never thought, was he Jewish or homosexual? It never even crossed my mind. But anyway, so I remember that they designated that girls should come first in things like artsy type subjects, for example, English or history, those sorts of things, poetry and the like. Boys were still allowed, merit was still allowed to decide who came first in mathematics and science and chemistry and so on. That was still a merit thing, but the girls had to come first. Now, the way they did this is by, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, creating what they called the assessment system. And that's where the teacher could assess your work during the year and then give you a grade based on that. Now, it was meant to be primarily made up of did you hand in your assignments, and what grade did you get on the assignments, and the term tests and essays you're supposed to do and so on. It was meant to be based primarily on that, but they didn't do that. So girls who were traditionally getting like 5 or 6% in an exam were being given 100% of the assessment, whereas boys who did quite well in the exam, getting 75, 80%, 90% in the exam, would get a very small mark of the assessment. So through this manipulation of outcomes, they were able to create, artificially put girls first in a number of subjects and put them much higher. So girls, whereas you'd have no girls in the top 10 or occasionally one, you now had 5 girls in the top 10. So that's how they are. So really this affirmative action's been around for a while. Then it moved out of high school into university. Now, this happened in 2 ways. One is they soft marked girls and again gave them grades so they could make the or gave them good marks so they could make the grade into university, and then gave them a lot of soft courses to study, like peace studies or gender studies, where nobody fails. And there was a huge multiplication of those courses, and of course soft marking them as well. So this created an explosion of girls having degrees in again, gender studies or English literature, majoring in feminist studies and so on. So, these were courses that the girl, no one ever failed at. So they did that. Then it was inevitable from then on, given that they'd addressed the gender inequality, particularly once there was mass migration began, that they would address race inequality. And inequality being a difference in outcomes. Everything is measured. Are the outcomes exactly equal? They're not. Must be racism, must be something bad. We then have to artificially address the inequality. Now, there were 2 arguments back in the time about this equal outcomes thing. One was, these brown and black people or whatever are being artificially held down by systemic, Nazis, Hitler. And so by gifting them unearned, non-meritorious, unearned positions at university, or degrees with honours and summa cum laude and all this sort of stuff, by gifting them that will then create a new generation of high achievers in that racial group, or amongst women, or whatever the minority they thought they were doing something for at the time. And so there was that. The other thing is just to say, well, we're just changing the composition. We're redefining what the parameters of success look like, and either way, it's going to create a fairer, more equitable society, given that black lesbians will have as many PhDs as everyone else. And then they targeted things like prestige, say, well, the self-esteem of that group, the black lesbians or whatever it might be, the self-esteem of that group is low. But if we gift them, like to just hand it out, PhDs, then their self-esteem will be higher, and will be able to. There'll be a prestigious element to this minority group, because they'll all have PhDs. Now, what these activists sort of failed to understand was that PhDs and degrees, back in the day anyway, at least had to be earned. Only 3% of kids made the cut from high school to go to university. So it was quite an elite group, really. Now, other than the kids of the super rich guy down the street who could buy a new wing for the university and get his kids shoehorned in there. But other than those well-connected rich people, everyone else had to compete. And there were at the time, there were a lot of scholarships offered. So if you were a bright kid and you came from humble circumstances, the government would give you a scholarship to pay for I don't know about everything, but certainly most of your studies, and the cost of books, and all that sort of stuff. And I remember kids at college would work various jobs to pay to get through college. I remember in the college break, I worked 3 jobs, a night job, a day job, and a weekend job, and I busted my ass. Didn't go out, didn't go drinking and carousing at the cocktail lounges, didn't go out chasing chicks or something like that. I was working hard and saving every penny. But not everybody was like that, by the way. Plenty of people were party goers, particularly the ones where the parents were sort of throwing money at them. But anyway, this idea of creating equal outcomes by artificially loading the dice was just gained traction. And when government said that they'd sort of loan kids the money to go to university, then suddenly there was this massive expansion of kids going to university. So instead of, and governments were budgeting, this year we want 40% of kids to go to university. It was budgeted. They even started paying families for their children to stay at senior high school. So, and the wage, and they were paying them roughly the equivalent of an apprentice's income. So if somebody was going to go, a kid was going to leave school at 15 and go to, become an apprentice, I don't know, electrician or plumber or carpenter or something. Instead of that, the government in Australia at least was saying, no, don't do that. Stay at high school, go through senior high school, and we will pay you, $100 a week, whatever it was, to stay at school. And that money we paid directly to the family. So really, it was the equivalent of more or less, the equivalent of the kid doing an apprenticeship. So this, it was assumed, would create an equal society, because the kids that were dropping out of school were the weakest students, the least capable students, and with bad attitudes towards study and behaving well in school. So they were encouraging them to stay on, and then gifting them passes to university, and then they would acquire this debt to do the study. So it was a whole sort of infrastructure of bypassing merit in any of its forms to create this equal outcome social nirvana bullshit thing that the wild-eyed ideologues want. But what it did, primarily is it diluted merit, which is what the globalists wanted. It diluted merit as being any sort of criteria for success or for prestige or for achievement or for getting a job or for getting promotions and so on. It just leached merit out of the entire process, and we can see the consequences of that today. I take an elderly relative to see the doctor frequently, and I'm aghast at the quality of doctors. The ones that even speak enough English they can understand them. The doctors are just people who've, it's hard to believe they've done any medical training at all. Have they been radicalized to believe Nazis were everywhere? Sure, but have they done any medical training? They just use checklists. They seem to have no idea what they're doing. They've got no power of analysis. They've got nothing, and they just go to a checklist and tick a box on it. And that seems to be the extent of it. And the effects I see in business, the amount of people, not that you didn't come across incompetent people previously, you did, but now it's so rare that I come across someone who is competent that it's a shock to see even a single competent person, which is a incredible turnaround from what it was 25, 30 years ago. Where you would mostly anticipate that people who reached a certain level had got there through merit by being very good at their job and having studied hard or got a PhD or whatever the case may be. Not that it was perfect back then, it wasn't, but it's way more perfect than it is today. So anyway, this affirmative action had a number of extremely negative consequences to society and to the economy and to the wealth. And bear in mind that from the time affirmative action was kicking off to today, the purchasing power of the paycheck has declined by 2/3. So if affirmative action has been so wonderful and we've got such a equal society, then why are we all so much poorer as a consequence? Now, some point to, well, look at all the big houses people have. Well, look at all the big debts people have. To achieve that wealth just through debt is hardly an achievement. Now, coming to things like hiring and so on, if merit alone had been a deciding factor, I would have employed or sanctioned the employment of very few non-white people. Racist. No, not at all. I never minded hiring and working with or being alongside black and brown people and so on. And as I think I've mentioned, many times, I've done a huge amount of international business traveling. And so I'm used to being the only white guy in the room or being the only white guy in the hotel or the white guy in the restaurant or the only white guy in the foyer. So, checking in and checking out, I'm the only white guy there. So I'm used to all that. And I'm used to spending many weeks, if not months on end, talking only to people who are not white. So I don't mind that. I've got no problem with it. I don't care. But when it came to hiring, and my only, given I'm paid by the company to do a job, given in hiring and sanctioning hiring, my only interest was hiring people who could do the job. I didn't want the aggravation and the drama of having someone who couldn't do the job. So I've got to stop what I'm doing and help them. And then I'm going to get questions from the CEO or the chairman of the board or someone saying, hey, Billy Bob, how come you hired Jimmy Jack there when you can't do the job? Those sorts of things. So for me, it was an academic. So can this person do the job? And are they going to be a problem to me in some way? As in, are they going to be arriving late, or are they going to walk around the office urinating in the pot plants, or that type of stuff. So behavioural. So unless I was sort of pestered by the board, I probably wouldn't have hired any of maybe a couple of the Sikhs. I probably would have, but I wouldn't have hired any of these people. I don't think. My experience with hiring black people was unfortunate. They again, look, I'm coming back to the affirmative action. I'm thinking of one black guy I hired here. He had 2 degrees, not 1 but 2 degrees, and yet he was almost illiterate. in English. Like he came from the United States. He was almost illiterate, and now I liked him, and he was a he's kind of a nice guy, I guess, but he had a huge chip on his shoulder, was always getting into fights and punch-ups as he went around. He's always imagining that people were putting him down and so on. And he liked having he was quite a big sort of solidly built guy, and I think he enjoyed sort of getting hold of some white guy and beating the shit out of him. But anyway, he had 2 degrees. He was illiterate. And I was under a lot of pressure at the time to hire a black guy or somebody who was black. It could have been a female, I suppose. But I was under a lot of pressure. I was getting questions. The CEO had done some course in equity. He'd been to the United States for a little while. He'd done some course in equity or some shit like that, and he'd come back with all these ideas of you got to hire black lesbians. And so he was in my. I was the EVP. He was in my face all the time about it, and every time we had the sort of the weekly meeting, or he'd be, hey Billy Bob, how come you haven't hired a black lesbian yet? And so I was sort of thinking, well, I got to do it just to get him out of my face. And so when a black guy came in who was he was quite well presented, so I thought, okay, well, that's fine. And given the role, which was a sales role, or business development as they call it now, but the sales role where he'd probably be interacting with a lot of young women. So I thought, okay, that might fit. So I hired, again, he had 2 degrees, but was nearly illiterate in English. So I thought, how the fuck can you get 2 degrees? But the guy had been on an affirmative action program. So they gifted him 1 degree, then gifted him another. Now, that had put him into a category where there are certain expectations you have of someone who's got 2 degrees, at least that they can fucking read and write. And they've got a certain amount of IQ. Now, the guy had an IQ of probably 95, I guess. He wasn't super bright. And he, again, the illiteracy was a problem. So I thought, okay, I can hire this guy, and he doesn't have to have a high IQ. And I was finding a job for him, or putting him in a situation where a dumb guy could still succeed. So I was already loading the dice and trying to recreate the environment to fit this affirmative action hire in. So would I have done that without being pestered? Would I have sort of recreated the job and the circumstances simply to fit someone in, simply because they were black? And would I have interviewed him if he didn't have these affirmative action degrees that he'd never earned in the first place? So everything was artificial about it. The artificial stay on at high school, the artificial degrees that he had. Then I artificially, the artificial desire to hire a minority. Then I artificially created a job just so this minority guy, so I could increase his chances of succeeding. So I was bending over backwards because I wanted to have a success for this black guy, just so I could point to it to get the. And I think a lot of the affirmative action hiring actually has motivations not dissimilar to that. So anyway, I hire the guy, and I get praise. The CEO is telling me, "Hey, Billy Bob, good move," and so on. So at least he got him out of my face on that one. But he was a disaster from the first place. He had this very dramatic relationship with his wife or girlfriend, whatever it was. Constant dramas from the home. He was borrowing money to fund his drug habit, and debt collectors were coming around looking for him. So there was plenty of drama there as well. He'd arrive at work at sort of about 9 o'clock around there, but he'd turn up in t-shirt and gym shorts, saying that he didn't have time to go to the gym. And he's pretty sort of fit guy, and everything. He didn't have time to go to the gym, so he'd have to go now, and he didn't have time to have a shower, so he would have a shower at the gym, and so by 10 o'clock he'd kind of be at his desk. And then he was quite a good he must have been an avid reader of like Brer Rabbit stories or something like that when he was a kid, because he was an avid sort of, and quite a good storyteller, really funny guy in his way. And so he would go in. This is in like the bullpen where the sales guys were. He'd go in there and he'd start telling stories, and he just had this way of making a funny story, and so everyone would stop work and listen to him. And yeah, some of them sales guys came in and complained, look, he won't shut up. He won't sit down and work. He constantly wants to tell stories and chat and talk, and which is affecting my work. So the white sales guys, the real sort of high achiever type, so they would come in and complain to me saying, hey, or they complain to like the sales manager who would come in and complain to me. But this was the sort of situation that he constantly arriving late, leaving early, and not really focusing on the job. So and he was constantly pestering me for pay rises. I hired sort of, really, if I look at the attitude and behaviour of the black guy, and then other black people I've come close to hiring or indeed have hired, that behaviour is the same. They've all got these affirmative action degrees. None of them particularly bright. None of them particularly interested. They want the trappings of what a good job and a good pay can get for them. They want the nice car, and they want to go out and do all the things that, they want to do the things that rich white people do. And they can't understand why on an ordinary job they can't afford that. I'm doing what you wanted. I'm doing what the white people want, and I still can't afford the waterfront mansion. Why? There must be something wrong. Must be fucking racism holding me back. So they got the very simplistic sort of view of what working for a living is like, and each one of them has had that. It's almost like they've come exactly out of the same ideological school of thought, even though they've come. One guy's from New York, another guy's from I think it was Sacramento, and another one's from somewhere in Texas, and black guys, but they think exactly the same way. It's stunning how they view the world, and in the exact same way, almost say the same things. They have the same phrases. They behave like they arrive late, and they goof off, and so on and so forth. They've constantly got money worries and dramas, and constantly seem to be getting into trouble with authority, these sorts of things. So now I also hired a number of sort of Indians and some Chinese and so on. And this idea that Indians and Chinese are supposed to be brilliant and incredibly clever and so on. They're good at swatting hard and passing exams. That you got to give to them. And how some of them, and they get a lot of affirmative action ones well. There are guys that are who could barely speak a word of English, but they supposedly got a PhD in English literature. And yeah, sure they did. So there's and hiring people from India who supposedly have PhDs in computer science and the like. I can't think of one that particularly impressed me. There are a few Sikhs who I'd rate as ordinary, like good enough to hire and keep employed. But I fired nearly all the Hindu Indians that I've hired. I fired nearly all of them in the end. They just didn't do the job. Just refused to do the job. So affirmative action has, I think, huge downsides. Having to hire. Again, I was under a lot of pressure in a number of jobs. I've had to elevate women into senior management roles. Why don't you have more women in management roles? And even to the point where I've had people from government departments calling me up, threatening and harassing me, saying, "Well, you should have 50% women management in your firm." This sort of thing. Why? Well, because ideological, because and there's no good reason. So if affirmative action has forced a huge number of artificial decisions and promotions and rewards and unearned, undeserved, non-meritorious behaviour. So the issue isn't so much affirmative action is being removed, as the Supreme Court decision would clearly suggest, but rather we move back to a situation of merit. Now, the globalists and the left hate this because a situation of merit will create a nucleus of people capable of resisting globalization. So the globalists are dead set against that. But for the wild-eyed, equal outcome Marxist type people, it means that if merit, the bigger role that merit takes, the more likely it is that straight white males will rise to the top, and that others will not do as well. And that terrifies the Marxist crowd of equal outcomes at all costs. They'd rather a bankrupt, desolate wasteland of equality rather than a rich and vibrant society where the brightest people rise to the top. They seem to be terrified of that, but are willing to embrace economic desolation, provided there's, as they would see it, ideological equality. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.